we start with the most important part of the talk, which is the keynote address by Professor Foster. I would like to introduce him very briefly with all of you. George Foster holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in economics from the University of Sydney and a doctorate from the Graduate School of Business, Stanford University. He taught at the University of Chicago and the Australian Graduate School of Management prior to joining the GSB faculty at Stanford University. George Foster's research and teaching includes entrepreneurship, early stage companies, financial analysis, etc. Professor Foster has won multiple research awards, including the AICPA Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Accounting Literature. He received the title the Order of Australia, declared in June 2019, for his significant service to education. And now I would like to welcome Professor George Foster for his keynote speech. Over to you, Professor Foster.
Well, thanks very much and welcome. It's good to be with a British Commonwealth country. And my favorite sport is cricket too, so I'm sort of very familiar with Bangladesh. Just as an introduction, my two areas that I focus a lot on are entrepreneurship and sports management. And one of the areas I focus on is building new ventures. And I've done a fair amount of research in this area. I was chairman of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Entrepreneurship, where we studied a whole lot of ways at which early stage companies are built up in different parts of the world. I've got two reports from the World Economic Forum that I led or co-led that I'm happy to send to ACCA that you can distribute. They're free of charge. World Economic Forum doesn't charge this, but they're about 500 pages each, so you may want to not read it overnight. But anyway, I think what I'll do is talk through some general areas of putting the pieces together of building a digital venture, and then give an example of a company that really relies on digital to do its goods and services, but really fascinating because its predominant early market was in education. Which all professors around the world have been using Zoom predominantly as the major forum of doing this. Basically, the slide here is, when I always look at new ventures or proposals for new ventures, I'm looking at a variety of areas to see where are the pieces in the place already, where are the pieces that have to be put in place. Because by definition, an early stage venture is just in its genesis. Now, sometimes it can be developed over time and it could be sizably put in place. Other times it's the germ of idea. And you have to understand what the difference is those two, because if it's a germ of idea, you're really betting on the management team. In order to capture value for consumers, you've got to have a business model, which enables you to sort of monetize what the value is. And that's an area where a lot of ventures created a lot of opportunities for consumers, but they didn't have the appropriate revenue. And I think this is one of the challenges in the educational sector, is that there is a lot of people coming on and providing free content, but free content doesn't allow you to sort of build scale because there's no revenues coming in unless you've got something like an advertising model, which education has never really cottoned on to. Maybe a subscription model may be doing. The three areas that you typically get will be transactions, subscription, and advertising. And you have to work out in the business model which set of those three that you're trying to do. Leadership, you're assessing that. There is a major dispute in venture capital in different parts of the world. Is it the leaders, is it the team, or is it the idea? I think a lot of people, if it's a very early stage company, are really fundamentally looking at the team. Because much as you'd like to think that you've got a very good idea of what the market opportunity is, the chances are when you get to scale, that opportunity will be morphed differently than you think. This is the example of Zoom. And it really does show a company that actually had its heritage in the 2006 era, or earlier, actually, it's mid-90s, 96, 98. A company came along called WebEx. And WebEx was a venture. It was the two founders, one was Chinese, one was Indian. They were both in Silicon Valley. And they developed a product that was an online interactive base where you could have conferences online. It was specifically targeted for the business end market. And one of the early employees of that was a individual called Eric Yuan, Y-U-A-N, who was a major technical person. He was born in China, but came to the US when he was about in the early 20s. And Eric was at that with WebEx, and WebEx got acquired by a larger company, Cisco. And Cisco is a company actually that came out of Stanford University when a husband and wife were trying to work out how they could communicate with each other. So they build what we call a network, and that was the heritage of Cisco. But the challenge was when they acquired WebEx, they didn't really put a lot of effort into developing that on an ongoing basis. And Eric Yuan got very disillusioned by the progress that had been made in terms of addressing the issues that he wanted. And so do the next slide, Hector. This is, I actually use this as a case in class, and this is a student example of what are the steps in terms of utilizing this. And I'm not going to read the stuff at the bottom, but what 2013, this was the early days of Zoom. And they tried to get funding and nobody would fund them because they said, if you are building a company and it's just a online conferencing company, that is a digital online conference company, there are already major competitors out there like WebEx now is Cisco and Microsoft was in the game. And so Eric found himself, a lot of people saying, why are you doing this? You're beating your head against the wall. But what he decided to do is he said, whereas the existing products had been built up over time and they were built for enterprise markets, they were very complex to operate. What he said, I'm going to go and I'm going to design a product that is the ultimate in simplicity. I'm going to build it from the grassroots. And there were about 20 or 30 people with Cisco who were so attached to Eric and his vision that they left Cisco and joined him. So they were on very good salaries at Cisco. And they went to this startup that everybody was saying, this is not going to work. But the key thing that he was doing is he's saying, I want to go and make customers. And they have a philosophy at Zoom of making customers happy. It sounds trivial, but it's not trivial if you believe that means you got to take account of customer feedback all the time. What was their first market test of success? Well, what they did is they went into the education market, and the education market, their first place that they tried was at Stanford University. And so they had several online courses that we were operating with much more complex online facilities. But the trouble is they were sort of just many to one. There wasn't much interaction in terms of from an education angle. And over time, what WebEx has tried to do is create as much as possible an interaction between, as if you're in a room with a professor and there's back and forth and a capability of having like breakout rooms that sometimes we use in teaching. And so his argument was going into education was a very demanding market because the students would give feedback very quickly if this wasn't simple. They would, if they had trouble getting on, the professors would hear about that very, very quickly. And so that was a successful first step. He then went into one or two other universities who had the same reaction, that the students said, this is a much more compelling product. And so the contract that was written was a contract with the university at a very low rate, which was 1/10 of what Stanford had been paying WebEx to operate some of these online educations. So he said, what we're offering is simplicity. We have a business model. It's only going to work if we get a lot of scale. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to use that as a proof of concept and expand into other markets. And then he started to say, okay, we don't want to go into the enterprise market at the high end because that's too demanding. And actually, that was one of their Achilles heels in initial sense, is their security wasn't as good as what it was with Cisco. And that came back to haunt them later. But they went into the small and medium business market, and they started to make success in that, which was about 2017, 2018. Next slide. Now, one of the things, and again, I'll leave these slides with you so that you can use this as an example. One of the things that I like to do is talk about how does a team build up its management? How does a company build up its management team? Well, what happens in Silicon Valley is that people go to one company and they start to navigate or to sort of follow one or two people. And what this means is that Zoom, when it started, several employees had been with, well, I said 20 to 30 engineers had been with Eric at Cisco. They came across, but interestingly, some very senior people had also been with Eric at WebEx before they got acquired by Cisco. So he had a group of loyal employees, and part of the secret is these employees were part of the vetting machine in terms of who joined the company. So normally what happens, one of the challenges is when you hire people in an early stage company, a lot of those people don't work out. Now, that's because you don't have that much background on them. And they tell a good story when you're doing interviews, but over time, it just was, there's not a good fit, or they overpromised or what their ability was, or it could have been you didn't know how to use them properly. But what had happened here is that these are all people who knew each other for quite a while, and they decided as Zoom made a lot of progress, they weren't going to allow other people to come in who would destroy the culture. And in a fast-growing company, the more you can sort of keep the management team relatively well aligned, that's a central thing in growing a company. It's also central if you say hire a new marketing person who's going to be head of marketing, that person has to have a very good sense of what it's like to work in an early stage company. Now, in the US, if you start hiring people from very large enterprise companies because you think they could sell in the enterprise market, that's a trap that a lot of these companies, early stage companies, fall into because they're used to having a personal assistant. They're used to going business class on airplanes, those type of things, and an early stage company can't handle that. And so there was a real culture created there of this is a fast-growing, highly structured culture, and we're going to keep on growing fast if we retain as much as that culture. So the employees were very much the gatekeeper who got into the tent as well as the CEO. Next slide. And this is just an example of a buildup. Most of the cases, I've done 100 cases, and probably 30 or 40 of them are on early stage companies. It's very unusual to be able to trace where the employees came from and what was a relationship before. Because I had written cases on WebEx and I knew Cisco very well, I was able to sort of build up this as an example because Zoom is such a massive success story now. We could go back and say, okay, well, these are all people who joined in these years. They're still there. And that's a very remarkable thing in terms of Silicon Valley. And the one or two exits have exited very much for personal reason and have not gone to other companies. They've taken some of the money they made from Zoom and started investing in their own ventures, or they've decided that they wanted to sort of spend a bit more time with the children on that. Next slide. Next one too. That's just okay. So one of the other things you want to do is build a board of directors. And this also gets to the financing of the company. As I said, when they started in 2011, they really didn't get much money till about 2013, 2014. The first major investor actually was the former CEO of WebEx. So the former CEO of WebEx knew Eric from his WebEx days and he also went to Cisco and had not a very good experience in Cisco, and he said, I will back Eric no matter what. And so he wrote him a check for $250,000. And so, that's obviously worth a lot now, but I mean, that's the sort of thing you need, because the venture capitalists were saying not really interested. The very first major named investor was about 5 years later, was a company, Sequoia, which is one of the three biggest venture capitalist firms in Silicon Valley. And once they got on board, there was a lot more credibility added to the organization. So it in the early days, it was growing reasonably well. Next slide. Okay, next slide too. No, I'll just go through this. This is the funding of the company. And what you can see is that February 2015, they did raise a round of 30 million. So the amounts raised was 250,000. And then in 2013, 9 million. Then they raised another 6.5. But the first, what I call sizable amounts for Silicon Valley, was a 30 million. But 30 million is not a lot of money if it's 4 years after on that. But this is where you can see Sequoia comes in and it puts in 114 million. Actually, they put in 100 million because there were some other people following on. So that's the financing of this company. It's now, I didn't look it up today, but it's probably worth 40 billion or something like in that order there. Next slide. Okay. So the other thing before we open it up for discussion on this, and I'll just make some comments on education sector innovations too. What happened is when the pandemic hit in February, March of 2000, Zoom was going along at a level of about 10 million, 5 to 10 million users at most. Really, it was actually about 4. And then what happened as the education market initially switched over, and this was a more consumer sector, switched over to start using Zoom, they had huge increases in adoption. But the trouble was the systems weren't developed for that. And this is one of the things that you have to do in building a high scaling company. Can you scale quickly? Well, most early stage companies have a ability to sequence their scaling because it's more driven by the internal development of the company. This was a pandemic where it was developed by this huge influx in demand from outside the company itself, and they either could make the decision, do we not fulfill that huge influx in demand, or do we sort of try and manage it? Well, logically, you would expect a Silicon Valley company will try to manage it. Well, I'll just show you some of the problems they ran into. Next slide. Next slide. This is just ways at which it expanded. Next. So what happened is in March, April, as the pandemic absolutely hit them, what we had is a variety of situations that forced Zoom into crisis management. So I'll just highlight a couple of them, and then I'll make some general comments. So one of them is Zoombombing. So next slide. Zoombombing is, and this occurred in a lot of the educational sector, is that a lot of the students would log in and they didn't protect themselves in terms of the universities using it, didn't require them to use as much security getting in as they should have. And other people got hold of the security and they started coming into the classes and making comments that some of them were racial. We have people coming in and exposing themselves sexually to the students. And so you could just imagine the challenge that this faced in terms of if you are trying to run a class and you got these third-party actors coming in who are trying to disrupt and destroy the educational atmosphere, that's the sort of thing that media likes to hammer a company on. So instantaneously, these Zoom bombing examples became on national television, broadcast, cable television, all around the world. And the trouble for Zoom is that Zoom now became very much not online teaching, but you're Zooming. So Zoom started to change from being a noun to a verb. I mean, just as like,
Professor Foster, if I may interrupt, there were cases of pedophiles getting into the Zoom classes of young children, and
yes,
there were cases of abuses too.
yes. So imagine some universities said we're not going to use Zoom anymore, and so Zoom had to do a lot of education in terms of ways at which to protect themselves. A second example, and this is really the security. Next slide. The security breaches, and the Zoom bombing was security breaches, but what happened here is that highlighted to a whole lot of corporates that this wasn't a secure platform. And so then they had to sort of really come in and beef up the security.
Professor Foster, I would like to ask or request to give a bit details about what are the roles of teachers. What are the role of teachers in creating and promoting entrepreneurship at Stanford University?
All right, yeah, I'm used to controlling at my end. Just in terms of teachers, so the professors have several roles. One is obviously to teach basic core classes such as accounting and finance and marketing, but more importantly, in the second years and a lot of other classes, we do courses specifically on entrepreneurship and different parts. We've got over 40 different courses in our curriculum that the students can do on that. Some of the courses are actually building and packaging a company where they have to go out and sort of do experiments in the field to find what a customer's wants in this area, how are they being existingly met. We have courses in terms of entrepreneurial finance, which talks about getting to understand the various ways at which finance for early stage companies is operated, whether they're through angels or other mechanisms. There are also courses on really international entrepreneurship. So how does that vary across different parts of the world? But I think the most exciting thing is that when we teach cases, we actually have the entrepreneurs in the class. So when I teach a case on Zoom, in the case I wrote, there are about 5 executives from Zoom quoted in that case. And so we did 1-hour interviews with 6 or 7, and Eric Yuan gave us several hours of interview. That enabled us to bring them into the classroom when we're teaching. And so the students can actually see the entrepreneurs being inspired, and we don't always tell success stories. If an entrepreneur has a failed venture and is wanting to talk about that, and we have examples of that in the classroom, the students get exposure to that. And most of the cases are written actually from students who came out of Stanford. Not always, but what that means is that the students can see actually the role models in front of them, not just a case, but they can also ask a lot of questions about why did you do that? Or would you do that again? Or those type of questions. And so they actually see inspiring stories or depressing stories. So they get to understand, is this entrepreneurship for them? Because I think one of the key messages is not every student has to be an entrepreneur. I mean, that's just not feasible. And so some of them want to go to larger companies. That's fine. But they've got to learn that they shouldn't go out to the field and sort of learn that cold. They should have experience by interacting with these people. So, and as we get them to do projects on existing companies, I choose which of those companies I'll write a case on. And one of the criteria is, will the entrepreneur be willing to come into the classroom? And if the entrepreneur says, no, I don't have the time, it doesn't make sense to me to allocate valuable teaching time to a person who can't inspire my students. I've got to inspire them somewhat, but they look at an educator sometimes as, well, you're a platform for our learning, but we don't really see you as a successful entrepreneur. And some of them are very cynical and say, well, if you're a successful entrepreneur, why are you here? And so I say, well, I'm a successful teacher, and that's a vocation that's very important. But my role is to get the best out of their students, And for those who want to do entrepreneurship, I provide an effective platform. For those who want to go into sports management, I've got enough contacts globally in sports that I can guide them on that too. So I think, and the other thing is to teach them frameworks. So that framework that I said at the start, that's a rigorous approach that they have to go through and check along the way on that, and then learn from that if they're not making progress. Because if you don't meet your milestones in some way, shape, or form, you're going to have a lot of struggles in growing the company. It's not starting a company, it's scaling the company that's the challenge. Starting a company is very easy. Building scale and a sustainable scale is the much more hard part.
I have another question actually. During this pandemic, most of the universities in the world are offering online courses. The whole things are operated online, not face to face. In Bangladesh, Daffodil International University is leading from the front. We are totally online, and our quality and standard are in online education are equal to the practices in the Australian universities like Monash, I believe. So now actually I have a very small question to Professor Foster as for the second time, that how they are conducting classes, means all the classes, all the programs are online, or do they do anything face to face?
No, we are doing classes both. In the last 12 months, most of our classes have been online, but and increasingly what will happen is some classes will be taught in person, and there will be an online component. And what the digital world has enabled us is to have reach both to a broader set of students, but also we can bring in guests from everywhere. And so if I'm teaching a class on, say, a global expansion of company going into, say, Singapore, what I'll do is, like, one of the persons I know is Yinglang Tang is one of the students I'm very familiar with. Well, Yinglang has gone back to Singapore. He was at Carnegie and Harvard and Stanford, and he set up a VC company called Insignia. Well, very, very successful VC company. I can bring him into my classroom, and it's wonderful. And I mean, he's set up, he's investing in a whole lot of ventures in Southeast Asia. And so if I've got students who are really inspired to think about global entrepreneurship, why not bring global entrepreneurs into the classroom? And that's what the digital world enables us to do. So I mean, if I'm teaching a class on, I'm teaching a class on the Indian Premier League, the cricket league, okay? Well, I can ring up somebody at the BCCI and ask them to come into the classroom because I'm pretty familiar with that world. Just imagine how inspiring that is to the students. Now, they may not tell me. I'm not sure the BCI would let me give me the full story on anything on that sort of stuff, but at least the students can see that. So I think it's really exciting that it's opened up a whole new world, that the digital, it's called the World Wide Web because it's on the worldwide. So I think it's exciting.